700 tons of food. No cameras, no press. No colonial strings. While the West turned off the taps, Russia showed up with sacks of wheat, oil, and defiance. Not to save Africa, but to prove the West was never feeding us to begin with. They locked the pantry. Russia broke in, with bread, not bombs. This isn't aid. It's an act of war against the lie of mercy. Russia didn't just intervene, they interrupted a system. This wasn't a side note in diplomacy. This was a crack in the colonial pipeline. While the so-called international community punished Burkina Faso for kicking out NGOs, Russia ran the blockade. Where were the IMF food credits? Where was ECOWAS with their solidarity? Where was France, the so-called friend of the Sahel? Nowhere. Because the punishment had been issued: starve Traore. Starve his government. Starve his people. Starve the idea of African resistance. But Russia moved in silence. Through WFP corridors, yes, but not through the traditional choke points of partnership. No signing ceremonies. No investment deals. Just 700 metric tons of sovereignty. Sugar, oil, rice, not weapons, not drones, not cultural pamphlets. Food, pure, real, unbranded. They didn't ask Ouagadougou to privatize water first. They didn't demand an inclusive democratic roadmap. They didn't tell us to host NGOs or die. They just sent food, where the West sent threats. And that's why this was a geopolitical earthquake. Because if one African state can receive aid without kneeling, then others will start asking questions. What is aid without conditions? What is help without surveillance? What is support without strings? This is bigger than a food shipment. This is an ideological breach in the dam of neocolonial control. The Russia drop shattered the illusion that African survival depends on Western mercy. And make no mistake, they are scared. Not because we're eating, but because we're learning who truly starved us in the first place. Let's rewind. Why was Burkina Faso even in this position? Because Traoré, young, uncompromising, unarmed, banned the foreign NGOs, and not randomly, not recklessly, but because he identified the real terrain of war, the aid economy. Behind every imported tent was a Trojan horse. Behind every health worker, data collection. Behind every clean water project, ideological infection. Traoré cut the cables. He shut down the invisible wires feeding dependency. And for that, they came with silence first, then with sanctions. The same groups that praised local solutions vanished when locals demanded independence. The punishment wasn't declared, it was delivered. Medicines blocked. Funding frozen. International NGOs gone. No more food drops. They left us in the desert. Not because they lacked resources, but because they lost control. But that's where Russia's move rewired the whole game. They didn't need to lecture us on self-determination. They just respected it. They didn't punish us for rejecting NGOs. They just bypassed them. They didn't ask us to reopen the gates of sabotage. They brought supplies without ideology. No colonial smiles. No strategic partnerships. Just the material proof that aid can arrive without submission. This was defiance in the form of logistics. Calories as a counterstrike. Every shipment said, "You don't own them anymore." Because this moment just exposed the entire con. That humanitarianism isn't help, it's hierarchy. You're allowed to eat, but only if you obey. You're allowed to live, but only if you kneel. You're allowed to trade, but only if you trade your soul. Traoré refused, and the world expected him to fold. Expected Burkina Faso to break, but 700 tons of food later. The West is quiet. Their story collapsed. The Traoré is starving his people narrative, buried under Russian grain. This is the new face of African resistance. Not just soldiers and speeches, but logistics, agriculture, trade realignment, the blockading of cultural poison. Russia didn't liberate us. But they revealed the lie that we were ever free just because they fed us. They showed Africa that you don't have to die when you disobey. You can live outside the NGO grid. If you're tired of the same recycled lies, if you see through the scripted hunger, subscribe, share, stay alert. The rebellion isn't coming. It's already here, and it smells like fresh grain delivered in Defiance. Not mercy, sovereignty. How NGOs became camouflage for covert arms. They didn't just bring rice. They brought radios. They didn't just carry blankets. They carried biometric scanners. They didn't just arrive with first aid kits. They arrived with battlefield maps. The West didn't lose access to a charity network. It lost access to its camouflage. Because what Traore banned in Burkina Faso wasn't aid. It was a war grid, wrapped in white trucks and fake neutrality. And when that grid got unplugged, the silence wasn't just political. It was operational. No more checkpoints disguised as clinics. No more satellite dishes hidden on school rooftops. No more cross-border logistics flowing from Mali and Niger under the label of humanitarian corridors. The NGOs weren't neutral. They were shielded. They operated above the law, outside local scrutiny, and inside every corner of African life. They passed through customs without inspection. They moved trucks through conflict zones without question. They landed planes that no military could track. All in the name of mercy. But behind the mercy was mission. Traore knew this. He saw the patterns. Every time a village was hit by rebel forces, the same trucks had passed through days before. Every time infrastructure was bombed, there had been a humanitarian assessment the week before. Every time the AS Bloc tried to assert control, NGOs screamed about human rights violations while quietly flying equipment over borders at night. This wasn't aid. It was cover. And that's why cutting them off wasn't just policy. It was preemptive defense. Because these organizations didn't just distribute relief. They distributed surveillance. They didn't just offer training. They offered allegiance. They didn't just document suffering. They documented coordinates. While Burkina Faso focused on fighting terrorism, foreign NGOs were installing social engineers, funding front groups, and mapping critical roads, not to help, to prepare. To prepare for collapse. To prepare for regime change. To prepare for recolonization by civil society actors. And when the military command said enough, when Traore cut them off, suddenly the so-called global community cared. Not when rebel cells bombed roads. Not when farmers lost entire seasons to sabotage. But when their NGO pipeline was dismantled, they called it authoritarian. They called it paranoid. But the files don't lie. The satellite logs don't lie. The truck manifests don't lie. Weapons moved under the stamp of relief. Intel moved under the banner of compassion. Chaos traveled in the backseat of charity. The same convoys that dropped off soap in the morning were crossing borders at night without inspection. And when Traore demanded transparency, they screamed repression. When he asked for registration of foreign workers, they called it xenophobia. When he suspended their permits, they activated the press. Because the aid was never the point, the access was. Access to terrain, access to borders, access to people's minds. That's why these groups reacted like NATO had been expelled. Because in many ways, they were. The line between soft war and hard war has blurred. There are no front lines anymore, and NGOs became the boots on the ground before the boots. In Mali, they did it. In Niger, they did it. In Chad, they tried. But in Burkina Faso, Traore pulled the plug, and when the system went dark, they panicked. Because they weren't just losing territory. They were losing intelligence. They were losing future insurgents. They were losing their clean war, the one they could wage under the cover of concern. That's why food was cut off. That's why funding was frozen. That's why media went rabid. Because when NGOs get expelled, it's not just about food. It's about the closure of an entire war channel. And Russia saw that. Russia didn't walk in with NGOs. They didn't come with euphemisms. They came with wheat. Because the air war was over and the information war was exposed. Traore didn't wait to be overthrown. He dismantled the infiltration before it bloomed. And that decision might be the most strategic move since Sankara nationalized the land. Because Burkina Faso didn't just refuse aid. It refused espionage dressed as salvation. And now the world knows. When an NGO truck parks outside your village, ask who's inside it. When a foreign volunteer arrives with laptops and surveys, ask who trained them. When a grant arrives for resilience and democracy, ask which embassy approved it. Because the war is no longer announced by uniforms. It's announced by logos. And if you're not looking closely, you'll thank your invader before you bury your harvest. Burkina Faso saw it and shut the gates. The question now is, will others? They said Traore was starving his people. They wrote it in bold headlines. They said Burkina Faso had turned its back on the world. They framed the expulsion of NGOs as brutality. But when Russia dropped 700 tons of food, grain, oil, sugar, not a word made it to their front page. That silence was louder than any scream. The same voices that howled about humanitarian crisis went mute the moment real food arrived. Because the narrative collapsed, and when a lie falls apart, the first thing they do is pretend it never existed. This is media warfare, and it runs deeper than bias. This is psychological sabotage dressed as reporting. When NGOs were kicked out, headlines poured in: dictator, authoritarian, anti-West. They told the world that Traore was isolating Burkina Faso. They showed pictures of empty shelves, but not the ships being blocked by sanctions. They filmed the hungry child, but never asked why IMF funding was frozen. They lit the camera, but never the truth. Because the goal was not to inform, it was to punish, to make an example out of resistance, to send a message to Mali, to Niger, to Guinea. If you unplug from the NGO network, this is what we will do to your image. It is not about food. It is about framing. It is not about concern. It is about control. Words become weapons. Silence becomes strategy. And every media outlet becomes a loaded gun pointed at any African who refuses obedience. They frame resistance as recklessness. They call sovereignty instability. They call defiance chaos. And when you refuse to host their NGOs, they don't just leave. They attack with headlines. International press becomes an extension of policy, an amplifier of threats, a recruiter for sanctions, a soft tool of siege warfare. Because once they strip your reputation, the world justifies your starvation. Look at the pattern. In Syria, same playbook. In Venezuela, same vocabulary. In Zimbabwe, same rotation of terms. Crisis, strongman, failed state. And in Burkina Faso, same script. But now, that script is falling apart. Because the food arrived, not from the West, not from France, but from the one country they didn't script into the story. Russia. And their silence after that delivery said everything. No retractions, no corrections, no apologies. Because the media is not a mirror, it is a weapon. And once the target changes the story, the weapon malfunctions. But here's the truth they never wanted printed: Burkina Faso didn't collapse. Traore didn't fold. The AES bloc didn't starve. And the West didn't save us. They isolated us. Then blamed us for the isolation. They sanctioned us. Then reported on the suffering as if it fell from the sky. And that is the sick loop of media psych ops. They break your bones, then film your limp. They deny your oxygen, then ask why you're gasping. This isn't journalism. It's strategic narrative warfare. Because every NGO war needs a public relations wing. Every proxy war needs a proxy microphone. Every psychological operation needs a headline. And the press badge, it functions like a passport. It moves across borders untouched. It enters conflict zones protected. It interviews insurgents, then sanitizes the story for evening news. That badge is not neutral. It is a shield, a disguise, a signal that says, this narrative is approved. This coverage is calibrated. So when they call Traore a threat, remember, he is. But not to the people, to the program, to the fiction, to the colonial PR machine that cannot survive without a villain. And now, the villain isn't a warlord. It's a soldier who feeds his nation outside the colonial menu. That's why they're quiet. Because the moment Burkina Faso received food without conditions, the lie became too obvious to print. They can't say he starved his people, because they're eating. They can't say he isolated the country, because Russia filled the vacuum. They can't say the NGOs were neutral, because peace returned without them. And now the media machine is jammed. So they shift, they pivot to fear, they whisper, Russian influence. They panic over multipolar instability. They frame independence as danger. Because when the old handlers lose control, they don't reform, they retaliate. But this time, Burkina Faso is watching. The youth are decoding the headlines. The AES Bloc is building parallel press networks. The filters are failing. The spell is breaking. And when the media no longer controls the narrative, the empire starts to fall apart. Because if they can't define the rebellion, they can't stop it. They didn't come to feed us. They came to replace us. They came with sacks of grain, while our own farmers lost the will to plant. They came with donated milk, while local dairies spoiled in silence. They came with medicine packs, while our pharmacists closed shop, and they called it generosity. But this wasn't generosity. This was economic occupation. NGOs weren't just providing aid. They were building a shadow economy. A system that didn't empower Africa. It erased it. A system where no one produced because production was foreign. Where no one built because construction came attached to contracts. Where no one farmed because free food arrived by truck, not by seed. That's how you break a nation. Not with bullets. With benevolence. Every shipment of free grain destroyed a market. Every subsidized clinic undercut a private doctor. Every foreign training center became a factory for foreign, aligned minds. And the worst part, they did it in the name of compassion. They didn't invade. They inserted. They wrapped economic dependency in moral language. They called it humanitarian outreach. They said it was about saving lives. But the only thing being saved was Western influence. And every time an African government questioned this imbalance, the answer was the same. If you stop the aid, your people will starve. If you reject the NGOs, the hospitals will shut down. If you nationalize services, investment will flee. Fear became the currency. Submission became the model. And for decades, that model ruled. But then Traore said no. No to ghost economies. No to charity that kills capacity. No to food drops that flatten farmers. No to foreign clinics that steal patients and staff from national hospitals. He said the truth plainly. Africa cannot industrialize through donations. It cannot grow by waiting for gifts. It cannot feed itself by being fed by outsiders. And the response? Sanctions. Funding cuts. A media storm. And the removal of Burkina Faso from the donor circuit. Because Traore didn't just kick out the NGOs. He kicked out the illusion. He proved that food could arrive from a non-Western source. That aid could land without undermining local industry. That sovereignty could feed itself. And when Russia delivered 700 tons of real food, no loans, no conditions, no private contractors, the lie collapsed. Because here's what they never wanted Africa to know, that you can receive support without selling your future. That you can grow without signing IMF reform packages. That you can feed your people without World Food Programme branding every grain. That aid is not the only option, because charity was never neutral. It was targeted, it was selective. It was used to reward submission and punish defiance. When you obey, the food flows. When you resist, the trucks stop. That's not aid, that's leverage. That's extortion. And when food becomes a weapon, those who control it become your rulers. Not with armies, but with storage units. Not with uniforms, but with spreadsheets. This is what Traore unplugged. He didn't just fight insurgents. He fought the economy of dependency. Because if farmers don't grow, the country doesn't grow. If producers collapse, culture collapses. If every corner of the economy relies on foreign lifelines, there is no sovereignty, only survival. That's why NGOs had to go. Because their presence was never passive. It was active disruption, a soft war on local initiative, a long siege on national dignity. And now that they've been expelled, what's rising is not chaos, it's clarity. New agricultural plans, regional trade within the AES bloc, supplies coming from non-Western routes, food as strategy, not charity, markets being reborn, not donated into oblivion. This is the real post-NGO future, not isolation, but independence, not scarcity but strategy, not collapse but recalibration. Because Africa doesn't need to be saved. It needs to be left alone to rebuild. And when the fake helpers leave, The real builders appear. Russia showed that. Not through military bases, but through basic, logistical defiance. They didn't lecture. They didn't audit. They didn't colonize with compassion. They just delivered. And let Africa decide what to do with it. That is the future, where trade replaces tribute, where production replaces pity, where dignity replaces dependence. And it begins with rejecting the NGO economy before it eats your own. They said they were here to help our youth. They built learning centers. They sponsored art competitions. They handed out tablets, T-shirts, mentorships. They used words like inclusion, empowerment, innovation. But what they were building wasn't a future. It was a firewall between Africa's children and Africa's memory. Because aid wasn't just about food. It was about programming, cultural reprogramming. They didn't want to change policies. They wanted to change perception, not through war, but through apps, curriculums, campaigns, and role models selected by embassies. They didn't teach our youth to grow food. They taught them to write grant proposals. They didn't teach self-defense. They taught them to organize protests against their own military. They didn't teach them history. They replaced it with imported narratives, global slogans, and foreign heroes. This was the long war, the patient one, where the enemy isn't at the border, it's in the classroom. Where the battleground isn't territory, it's memory. That's why every NGO had a youth initiative. Because if you capture the mind of a generation, you don't need an army. They'll hand over their country willingly. They'll grow up thinking dependency is natural. That rebellion is reckless. That tradition is backward. That sovereignty is extremist. And they'll chant slogans that were designed in Brussels, not in Ouagadougou. This is why Traore didn't just expel aid groups. He unplugged the indoctrination grid. He knew that sovereignty without cultural clarity is temporary. That even if you win militarily, you lose if your youth believe they're incomplete without the West. Because what's the point of winning a border war if your future leaders are being trained by your historical enemy? What's the value of land if your children are ashamed of the language spoken on it? What's the meaning of independence if every scholarship pulls your brightest minds away from building their homeland? This was the deeper sabotage, not just economic, not just humanitarian, but generational. They came into schools with education partnerships. They installed youth leaders trained in their embassies. They funded influencers to push modern values. They broadcast campaigns against radicalization, but the only radicals they targeted were African thinkers. They came with mentorship, but the goal was alignment. They came with empowerment, but the goal was confusion. They didn't need to erase Africa by force. They taught Africa to erase itself. Through digital platforms, through exchange programs, through mental maps designed in think tanks thousands of miles away. And they wrapped it all in language that sounded noble: human rights, civic engagement, democratic resilience, all code words for engineered obedience. So Traore shut it down, because this was never about training leaders. It was about training proxies. It was about preparing the next generation to fear their own strength, to distrust military sovereignty, to see Western alignment as success and African autonomy as regression. And the funding followed the agenda. If your youth project aligned with their values, the money flowed. If your curriculum taught cultural roots, it dried up. This is how a generation is lost, not to famine, not to disease, but to frameworks. But now, the reset has begun. The foreign education pipelines are being exposed. The propaganda partnerships are being terminated. The youth are waking up. The digital spell is breaking. And in its place, something older is rising: oral history, lineage, indigenous knowledge, military literacy, sovereignty, not as a slogan, but as a lifestyle. Because when aid stops, truth returns. When the programming ends, the signal of self resurfaces. Traore didn't just remove NGOs from the terrain. He removed them from the imagination, and that may be his most dangerous act. Because now, the youth are no longer asking how to join the world. They're asking how to rebuild their own. And when that question spreads across the AS Bloc, the last phase of control collapses. Because the mind was their final battlefield, and they just lost it. They said it was mercy. They said it was compassion. They said it was help. But the help always came with a clause. The compassion always arrived with a contract, and the mercy always left us weaker than it found us. They gave us rice and took our farms. They gave us clinics and emptied our hospitals. They gave us grants and replaced our budgets. They gave us mercy wrapped in chains, and for decades we accepted it. Because we were told that to question the hand that feeds you is to invite hunger. Because we were told that without aid, we would collapse. Because we were told that sovereignty without charity was suicide. But then Traore stepped into the silence and did the unthinkable. He cut the cord. He rejected mercy. He chose defiance, and they retaliated, not with missiles, but with silence, with sanctions, with isolation, with headlines declaring the collapse of Burkina Faso. But what they didn't expect was that someone else would fill the vacuum. Not with ideology, not with indoctrination, just with grain. Russia didn't arrive with banners. They didn't sponsor exchange programs. They didn't rewrite our constitution. They delivered food, where the West delivered threats. And in that moment, something shattered. Not just the illusion of humanitarianism, but the entire structure built on fear, the entire aid regime propped up by guilt, dependence, and manipulation. Because now, Africa has seen behind the curtain. We've seen how mercy can be a muzzle, how help can be a leash, how generosity can become a weapon. They didn't want to feed us. They wanted to manage us, to use aid not as a gift, but as governance, not as assistance, but as authority. And every time we obeyed, the trucks rolled in. Every time we resisted, the taps shut off. That's not compassion. That's coercion. That's warfare disguised as relief. So now the question is simple. Will we keep begging from the same hand that builds the whip? Or will we finally learn to feed ourselves, on our terms? Because what Russia delivered wasn't just wheat. It was a message. That survival is possible without submission. That aid can exist without control. That Africa doesn't need to be saved. It needs to be respected. The West lost its monopoly on mercy the moment that food touched our soil, and they haven't recovered since. The NGOs are gone, the sanctions failed, the media spin collapsed, and still, Burkina Faso stands. Still, our people eat. Still, sovereignty breathes. This is the beginning of the post-NGO era, where logistics replace lectures, where trade replaces tribute, where dignity replaces dependence. This is what it looks like when the aid game dies, not with a declaration, but with delivery, not with speeches, but with silence broken by real supplies. And the West, they are watching. Because the old script is dead, and the new one is being written without them. No more mercy as a weapon. No more hunger as punishment. No more obedience bought with biscuits and blankets. The era is over. Traore didn't just ban the NGOs. He buried the narrative. He proved that freedom doesn't starve. It just stops waiting for permission to eat. So feed yourself, or be fed your chains. That's the choice. And the rebellion? It's no longer an idea. It's a supply line. It's a convoy. It's a harvest. It's a generation refusing to be programmed. It is here. Comment your thoughts. Share this with someone blind to the battlefield. Subscribe for the next revelation. Because this is no longer about aid. It's about Africa remembering itself. And this time, we eat on our own terms.